You don't usually see someone that color in first class. Are you sure you're not lost, darling? The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. They pierced the air with quiet cruelty, coated in a smile that barely masked their sting. The voice belonged to a blonde flight attendant whose uniform was as polished as her tone was pointed. Her name tag read Michelle, and the moment she saw Amara Blake step into the first-class cabin, something in her gaze tightened. Amara, just 12 years old, stood motionless at row 2, gripping her boarding pass with fingers that trembled slightly. She had checked the seat number 3 times before walking in 2D. It matched. She wasn't confused. But the way Michelle leaned in and lowered her voice, pretending to be helpful while lacing her words with disbelief, told Amara that being right didn't mean being welcome. All around her, eyes began to lift. From behind newspapers and over designer sunglasses, from tablet screens and wine glasses, passengers turned to look. Not one of them said a word, but their silence was loud with judgment. Some raised eyebrows, some pursed lips, some tilted their heads in amused curiosity, but none looked like they expected someone like Amara Black, small, wearing an oversized sweatshirt and sneakers that had seen too many schoolyard stow, belong in seat 2D. "I think this is my seat," Amara said softly, holding out the boarding pass. Michelle took it and stared at it longer than necessary. Her smile was thin, the kind people wear when they're about to say something dismissive in a professional way. "It's just very unusual, that's all," she said. "Do you have some kind of special permission?" There it was, that word, unusual. Like Amara was a curiosity instead of a customer. Like she was allowed here only if someone with power had made an exception. Michelle's tone wasn't inquisitive, it was preventative. It was the tone used on people who might cause problems just by existing in places they're not expected to be. When Michelle finally moved aside, she placed her hand too gently on Amara's shoulder. To others, it might have looked like a warm gesture, but Amara felt the weight of it, like a leash disguised as kindness. She stepped into the row and sat down. The leather seat was firm, expensive, and unwelcoming. She adjusted her backpack under the seat and sank back as far as she could. Across the aisle, a silver-haired man in a dark gray suit looked at her briefly. His expression wasn't harsh. If anything, it was unreadable, caught somewhere between surprise and familiarity, but he said nothing and looked away. His name, she would later learn, was Thomas Whitaker. Outside the window, baggage carts rolled slowly under low clouds. Inside, Amara sat perfectly still, aware of every breath, every glance, every assumption made about her before she'd even spoken a word. "Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or state in the comments. And tell me, have you ever been treated like you didn't belong just because of how you looked?" Amara Blake sat in seat 2D, her back stiff and shoulders drawn inward, as if trying to disappear into the smooth leather of the first-class seat. Around her, the ambient hush of the cabin was thick with tension she could feel but not name. The quiet clinks of glasses and murmurs of conversations did nothing to distract from the invisible weight of eyes pressing in from every direction, some curious, others skeptical, many judgmental. For a girl who had often been ignored in school hallways, grocery lines, and city buses, this kind of attention wasn't flattering. It was isolating in a different, crueler way. Across the aisle, Thomas Whitaker had returned to reading his book, a thick hardcover with no visible title. He hadn't looked at her again since that brief moment of eye contact, but Amara couldn't forget his face. Something about the way he had looked at her stuck in her thoughts, not scorn, not pity, but a sort of distant recognition she didn't understand. Before she could think more about it, footsteps approached. Michelle was back, holding a tray with a glass of sparkling water. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked. Her voice softer, gentler. Thomas gave a slight shake of the head. "I'm fine, thank you." Her warmth evaporated as soon as she turned around and spotted Amara. As she neared row 2, Michelle's smile shrank into a line. She leaned slightly toward Amara with the practiced posture of someone who wanted to appear helpful but not too engaged. "Just checking in," she said. "If there's anything unusual with your ticket, we'll be reviewing it shortly." Amara blinked. "Two think it's fine. I printed it from the confirmation email. It has my name." Michelle gave a short nod, but her voice took on a tone that wasn't quite polite. "Of course, it's just that sometimes these get processed through school programs or community partnerships. We just want to make sure everything checks out for security purposes." There it was again. That word. Community partnerships. Charity cases. The implication that her presence in this seat must have been a donation, not a decision. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about worth. Amara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the quiet rage of being sized up and categorized by someone who didn't know a single thing about her. Michelle glanced at her one last time, offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then walked off. 2 rows over, Amara caught a murmur from a woman in 2B. She leaned toward her husband, dressed in a sharp blazer and loafers, and whispered, "Maybe she's one of those inner-city scholarship kids. You know, the outreach programs?" Her husband chuckled, low and amused. "Looks like she just got off a Greyhound bus." Amara sat still. She heard it all. Every word. She turned her face to the window, blinking quickly to push down the sting. She would not cry. Not in this seat, not in front of these people. Her mind drifted to her mother, Naomi, and to James Williams, the man who had raised her, called her brave, taught her how to breathe through injustice. He had once told her, "Never be ashamed of where you're sitting, just know why you're there." The plane gave a small jolt, drawing a few murmurs and the sound of glassware clinking. The captain's voice came through overhead, calm and casual. "Just a little turbulence, folks. We're reaching cruising altitude. Should be smooth sailing all the way to London." As Amara exhaled slowly, trying to center herself, she heard a voice from across the aisle expected, measured. "First time flying alone?" She turned. Thomas Whitaker wasn't looking directly at her, but his head was slightly turned in her direction. His voice wasn't cold. It was steady, almost careful. She nodded. "Yeah? First time overseas, too?" He gave a single nod. "London's a good city. Are you visiting family?" Amara hesitated. "I think so. I was invited. Something about inheritance. My grandma said I should go. My mom's not doing too well." For a moment, his eyes flickered with something unreadable, but then his face settled again. "I hope it's a good visit," he said, and then turned back to his book. It wasn't a long exchange. It wasn't warm or deep. But it was the first time anyone on that plane had spoken to her like she belonged. The seatbelt sign had been off for a while, when Thomas Whitaker finally stood up and walked toward the lavatory. Amara barely noticed at first. Her mind had been drifting still, caught between the tight smiles of Michelle, the offhanded remarks from 2B, and the strange calm she had felt when Thomas spoke to her earlier. She stared at the window but saw none of the sky. Instead, her thoughts replayed in fragments, looping back to that photoless book he had held, and the flicker in his expression when she mentioned her mother. Then something shifted in the corner of her vision. A small photograph had fallen to the floor beside Thomas's seat. It must have slipped from his pocket when he stood. No one else noticed. The image face down, tucked half beneath his armrest. Amara leaned forward, paused, and reached down slowly. Her fingers brushed the edges. She picked it up. The photo was old, worn along the corners. Its edges curled slightly like it had been carried for years. The colors had faded, but the faces remained. A young black woman smiled brightly at the camera, her hair pinned up in soft curls, her arms folded gently in front of her. Beside her stood a man with kind eyes and a navy suit, one arm lightly around her shoulder. Behind them, a banner stretched between 2 trees. Baltimore Community Legal Center, Summer 1993. Amara's breath caught. She had seen that woman before in framed pictures in her grandmother's house, in one surviving family album, in the back of her own memory. It was Naomi, her mother. And the man standing beside her? That was James Williams, the man she'd always called her father. Her chest tightened. She flipped the photo over. Faint handwriting etched in black ink still clung to the back. Naomi James BCLC Picnic, July '93. A wave of confusion swept over her. Why did Thomas Whitaker, this cold, distant man, have a picture of her mother and James from 30 years ago? This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't random. The photo had been folded once, as if someone had stored it carefully in a wallet or case. It had been kept in purpose. Amara's hands trembled slightly as she held it. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the feeling in her gut was louder than her logic. Something about this didn't fit, and it had everything to do with her. BCLC. She remembered hearing that name before her mother had worked there, briefly, before Amara was born. Her grandmother mentioned it once, then changed the subject. Amara stared at the faces again, then at the handwriting. She felt as though she'd stepped into the middle of a conversation no one ever meant for her to hear. Footsteps echoed in the aisle. Panic rushed in. Amara slipped the photo into the front pouch of her backpack and straightened just as Thomas returned to his seat. He moved slowly, wincing slightly as he sat. He didn't look at her right away, just reached for the seat pocket in front of him, then stopped. His hand hovered there a moment longer than it should have, as if expecting something to be there. He checked again, more thoroughly this time. Still nothing. Finally, he leaned back in his seat and looked across the aisle. Their eyes met. This time, the connection held longer. Amara stiffened. He didn't ask a thing. He didn't accuse, but his gaze narrowed for a breath of a second, a subtle crease appearing near his temple. He knew. Or at least, he wondered. Amara quickly turned back to the window, heart pounding. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the photo itself, or what it meant that Thomas Whitaker wasn't just a stranger on the same flight. He was part of something larger, something tangled in her past. Michelle passed through the aisle with a forced smile and a tray of drinks, nodding at other passengers. She barely acknowledged Amara, as if the girl had already been boxed, labeled, and put out of sight. But Amara no longer noticed her. Her thoughts were far from the seat, far from the whispers of privilege or pity. She was thinking about that old photo, about Naomi's eyes, and James's protective stance. And she was thinking about Thomas Whitaker, now silent, now watching the clouds, perhaps remembering something he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The plane had returned to a steady cruise, and the noise of routine filled the cabin again. Pages flipping, glasses clinking, seatbelts clicking back into place. Amara sat quietly in seat 2D, her hands folded in her lap, but her mind had not settled. The photograph in her bag burned like a secret she wasn't meant to see. The more she thought about it, the more the image of her mother standing beside James now in the hands of Thomas Whitaker felt less like coincidence and more like the edge of something buried. She glanced across the aisle at Thomas. He sat upright, unusually still, his face angled toward the window, yet his eyes unfocused. Something in his posture seemed strange, detached, as though he were slowly being pulled inward by something heavier than jet lag. It happened quickly. One moment, he was still. The next, his book slid from his lap. His shoulders caved forward. His arms dropped. His head bowed. It looked like sleep, peaceful, even. But within seconds, it became obvious. He wasn't breathing. Amara's body moved before her thoughts did. She leaned forward slightly, eyes wide, unsure if anyone else had noticed. Then a gasp broke from behind, followed by a voice that said, "Sir, are you okay?" A man seated nearby reached over to touch Thomas's shoulder, but there was no response. Within seconds, alarm spread. The murmurs turned into panic. A passenger called out loudly, "We need help. I think he's having a heart attack. Michelle rushed in from the front galley, trying to take control. Please remain seated, she ordered, crouching beside Thomas. Her hands moved quickly, but her face betrayed her fear. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, then shook her head slightly. No pulse, she muttered, half to herself. Then louder. Is there a doctor on board? Anyone with medical training? The cabin fell into uneasy silence. A few people looked around nervously. A man in business attire stood halfway, hesitated, then sat back down. A woman murmured something about not being certified. No one stepped forward. I know CPR, Amara said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. Michelle spun around to face her. You? She asked, disbelief etched across her face. Amara nodded. We learned it at school. I passed the test last year. Michelle stood abruptly and moved between Amara and Thomas, her arm blocking the path. I'm sorry, but this is a serious situation. You're a child. Amara didn't budge. No one else is helping. Michelle's voice sharpened. Please sit down. I can't allow this. But Amara took one more step forward. He's dying. And I can try. For a second, it felt like everything in the cabin paused. Every eye turned toward the confrontation. Michelle looked shaken, not just from panic, but from the pressure of the moment. Then, without permission, Amara stepped around her and dropped to her knees. Her fingers found Thomas's chin, tilted his head back. She pressed down on his chest, just like she had learned 30 compressions, then 2 breaths. She kept her rhythm, counting in her head, trying to stay focused even as her heart raced. Tell the cockpit we might need to land, she said aloud, not looking up. Michelle froze. One passenger called out, Let her do it. Another echoed, She's the only one with courage. Suddenly the silence cracked. Thomas twitched. His chest rose weakly, then a gasp escaped his lips, dry and uneven. His eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. The crowd held its breath. He was alive. Amara leaned over and whispered softly, You're okay. You're okay. His lips parted again, and in a whisper so faint, she barely caught it, he said, You're her? She blinked. What? But his eyes had already closed, not from unconsciousness, but from fatigue. His breathing was shallow, but steady. He had come back. 2 more flight attendants arrived with an emergency kit. One, older and calm, gently replaced Amara's hands with his own. You did good, sweetheart, he said kindly. Amara stood slowly, legs shaky beneath her. She stepped back toward her seat, her breath uneven. When she looked up, the cabin had changed. People weren't staring at her with suspicion or pity anymore. They were watching her with awe, gratitude, even respect. She wasn't just the girl who didn't belong. She was the girl who had just saved a man's life. The tension in the cabin had begun to settle, but the stillness that followed felt even heavier. Thomas Whitaker lay semi-conscious, an oxygen mask gently covering his mouth, his chest rising and falling in a slow, uneven rhythm. The crisis was over, but what remained was something more intimate, an invisible thread stretched tight between past and present. Amara sat upright, her back straight, her hands pressed together in her lap. Her arms ached from the CPR, her pulse was still high, but her focus had narrowed to a single point. That moment when Thomas had looked at her and whispered, You're her. That sentence had carved itself into her thoughts, over and over, louder each time. A few rows away, a flight attendant knelt quietly beside Thomas, watching him closely. The emergency kit remained open nearby, packets and tubes strewn across the floor like artifacts of an invisible battle. Amara's eyes flicked toward them, then back to Thomas. And then, without speaking, the attendant looked at her and gave a single nod. He wants to see you, she said softly. Alone, if that's okay? Amara hesitated. Her heart skipped once, twice. But then she stood. She didn't feel brave, just drawn, as though her feet were already moving before her mind could ask why. She crossed the aisle and knelt beside him. Up close, Thomas looked smaller. The crisp edges of his image softened. He was no longer the composed man from earlier. He was human now, weak, exposed. Through the soft hiss of the oxygen, his voice came faint but deliberate. "I wasn't supposed to meet you like this," he said. His hand reached slowly into his coat pocket and withdrew a small silver key tied with a navy ribbon. "This belongs to you." Amara took it gently, her fingers brushing his. It was cold, but heavier than she expected. Locker 14, St. James Terminal. "In London," he whispered, "there's a box. Letter. Documents. It explains everything." Amara stared at the key, her mind racing faster than her breath. "Why me?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that was not pity, nor guilt, something far deeper. "Because you're my daughter." The air around them seemed to stop moving. Amara felt the words before she fully heard them. She blinked. "What?" He didn't repeat it. He didn't have to. "Your mother, Naomi." His voice cracked. "I loved her, but I left. I let James raise you. He was the better man." His eyes drifted closed for a moment, then opened again with effort. "I paid for what I could. Your school, some of the medical bills. I never made contact. I never earned that right." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You watched me?" He nodded weakly. "I never stopped. From a distance. I'm not proud of it, but I was there. In shadows." Amara looked down at the key. It glinted under the overhead light. Everything suddenly made sense. The anonymous scholarship, the quiet support, the time she got sick, and the bill just disappeared. "What's in the letter?" she asked. "The whole story," he said. "I wanted to tell it in my own words. One day, when you were ready, or when I no longer could." He smiled faintly, the lines in his face softening. "You're brave. Just like her." His breathing steadied slightly. "Don't remember me like this. Remember the moment you saved me. That's who you are." "Oh, bah." Amara's throat tightened. She couldn't speak. He slowly closed his eyes, but his hand rested gently on hers for one last second. And then he let go not into death, but into sleep. She rose to her feet, key in hand, and stepped back across the aisle. As she sank into her seat, the silence around her wasn't about suspicion or judgment anymore. It was the silence of revelation, of recognition, of a truth too heavy for any 12-year-old to carry, yet somehow she had. The key rested in Amara's hand like a weight that had waited years to be passed. She didn't know what the box in Locker 14 contained, but she knew it mattered. She had never asked for answers, but now that one had been whispered, more were pressing in louder, heavier. Across the aisle, Thomas Whitaker was sleeping, or resting, or retreating from what he had finally released. His confession hung in the air between them like vapor fading from sound, but impossible to forget. When the plane landed in London, medical personnel were already waiting. Thomas was wheeled off quietly, with barely a word, and though he looked fragile, he raised one hand toward Amara as he passed her row. She didn't wave back. She just watched him. The man who had once been a stranger, now a truth too large to hold. A representative from the airline met her at the gate. "You're the miner who assisted during the incident?" she asked. Amara nodded. The woman smiled. "We've arranged a private car to your destination. It's all been taken care of." Amara followed silently, clutching her backpack. As she sat in the back seat of the sleek black sedan, her fingers never left the key. The driver didn't ask questions. The city outside the window rolled by in a blur of gray stone, narrow streets, and red buses. London looked tired that morning, or maybe she did. They pulled into a train station, not the main one, but an older annex, less crowded. A sign above the entrance read, "St. James Terminal." Her heart skipped. The driver handed her a card. "This has the locker number and code. You'll find it inside." She stepped out, walked through the station alone. The floor tiles were cracked in places. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal. At the far end was a wall of numbered lockers, small, silver, anonymous. She found number 14. Her fingers shook as she inserted the key. The lock turned with a soft click. Inside was a dark blue envelope, thick and worn. On the front, in precise cursive, it read, "To Amara in truth." Beneath it lay a slim folder tied with a ribbon. She slid both into her bag and returned to the car. She didn't open the envelope immediately. She waited until she reached the townhouse where she was supposed to stay, the guest home of a woman named Clara, who introduced herself as a family contact. Amara wasn't sure what that meant. Clara was kind but quiet. And after showing her to a small upstairs room with a desk and a window facing the back garden, she left Amara alone. The room smelled like lavender and old wood. Amara sat at the desk, took out the envelope, and opened it. The letter was long, neatly written, dated 6 weeks earlier. "Amara, if you're reading this, then I've either told you the truth in person or you found it on your own. Either way, it's time you heard it from me. I met your mother, Naomi, at the Baltimore Community Legal Center in 1993. She was brilliant, fierce, the kind of person who made a room tilt just by walking into it. I was in awe of her. We were together briefly. I was already being shaped by family expectations, money, image, legacy. Naomi didn't fit in that world, and I didn't have the strength to stand by her when it counted most. I failed her. When she told me she was pregnant, I disappeared. I told myself it was better for her, that I would only cause damage. But the truth is, I was afraid. James Williams stepped in, and I let him. He became the father I could not be. I watched from afar, paid what I could. I stayed silent, convinced that my presence would ruin everything. But I never stopped loving you. Not from the first photo I saw of you on your 5th birthday. Not when I read your school essay about courage. You are, in every way, the best parts of both of them. This box contains documents, birth certificates, court filings, even a will I never filed. You can take them or ignore them. What matters is not what I left you in writing. What matters is what you now know in your heart. That you belong. That you were never a mistake. That someone, even from afar, was always proud of you. Thomas. Amara sat in silence, the letter trembling in her hands. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just breathed. Slowly, deeply. The truth no longer chased her. It had arrived. Saturday down beside her, whispered her name, and it had her mother's eyes. Amara had barely finished reading the last lines of Thomas's letter when the sound of a phone vibrating startled her. It wasn't hers. Clara, the quiet woman who had greeted her at the townhouse, stood outside the door holding a landline phone, her expression unreadable. "It's from the airline," she said calmly. "There's been a situation." Amara stood slowly, letter still in her hand. Her pulse quickened. "What kind of situation?" Clara hesitated, then said, "You'll want to see for yourself." Downstairs, the television was already on. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Passenger Incident Forces Emergency Landing, Horizon Star Flight 88. The footage showed an airport runway. Several emergency vehicles lined up along the tarmac. A blurry photo of Thomas Whitaker flashed next. Then shockingly, Amara saw herself, a still frame from the flight. She was leaning over Thomas's body, her hands in CPR position. Someone on the plane had filmed it. The anchor continued. Sources say a young girl believed to be 12 years old performed CPR and helped save the life of Horizon Star investor Thomas Whitaker. The airline has not released the passenger manifest, but video of the incident has gone viral, sparking international attention. Clara turned to her. It's everywhere, Amara. Social media, news sites. People are calling you the girl who saved the billionaire. Amara didn't speak. She couldn't. Her hands were cold, and her breath shallow. But that's not what happened, she whispered. He wasn't just a billionaire. Before Clara could respond, the phone rang again. This time, Clara listened longer. When she hung up, her tone changed. That was the Horizon Starboard's emergency liaison. They want to speak with you, privately. Today. Amara stared at her. Why me? Clara met her eyes. Because he told them. Right before he passed out again. He said you were the only one who knew the truth. A car arrived within the hour. It wasn't black like before, it was silver, armored, and clearly meant for someone under protection. 2 representatives met her at the entrance of a private office tower near the Thames. They didn't wear airline uniforms. Suits, lanyards, eyes that never stopped calculating. She was led into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the river. Inside sat 3 people. 1 woman with a clipboard, 1 older man in a navy tie, and a third who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The woman spoke first. Amara Blake, we understand you're the miner who performed CPR on Mr. Whitaker during Flight 88. Amara nodded. Yes. The man in the navy tie leaned forward. We also understand that Mr. Whitaker told you something before the medical team intervened. Something significant. Amara hesitated. She looked down at her hands. He told me he's my father. The room went still. The woman didn't blink. The man across from her scribbled something. The third, silent man finally spoke. Then you are the next of kin. Amara's breath caught. What does that mean? The woman pushed a folder across the table. Thomas Whitaker filed a confidential will 2 weeks ago with legal counsel in both the US and the UK. That will was activated the moment he identified you and confirmed it verbally in the presence of Horizon Star personnel. You are now his legal heir. Amara blinked, heart thudding. But I don't want anything from him. I didn't even know him until 2 days ago. The man in the tie nodded. We're not here to talk about money. We're here because this has become a public incident. Your name is attached to the most powerful investor in our airline, and the board is concerned about the narrative. Amara felt something shift. The story wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to headlines, lawyers, agendas. The woman leaned in. That's why we're asking no, urging you to keep what he told you private. For now, we'll offer a non-disclosure agreement, generous compensation, even media protection. Amara stared at them. Her mind echoed with Thomas's words, Remember the moment you saved me. That's who you are. She stood slowly. Number. The room tensed. Excuse me? The man asked. Amara took a deep breath. He told me the truth. That's all I ever wanted. I don't want his money. I don't want his headlines. But I won't lie about who I am, or who he was. The 3 executives exchanged looks. The woman finally said, Then this will get much bigger than either of us intended. Amara replied, steady as ever. Good. Let it. The storm didn't wait. Within 24 hours of Amara's quiet defiance in that glass-walled conference room, the truth began to ripple outward first as whispers, then as headlines, then as a global conversation. News outlets scrambled to confirm what social media had already suspected. The mysterious young girl who had saved Thomas Whitaker was more than a heroic bystander. She was his daughter. By the following morning, every major network ran some version of the same headline. Air in the sky. Black teen who saved billionaire is his secret daughter. The photograph of Amara performing CPR on the plane became iconic, splashed across screens, magazine covers, and TikTok videos, edited with dramatic music and commentary. Hashtags like #AirlineHair, #Blake and Whitaker, and number Truth in the Skies trended for days. But beneath the viral noise, something deeper began to stir. Opinion pieces flooded in. Some praised Amara as a symbol of resilience and dignity, an unshakable young woman who saved the life of the very man whose absence had shaped hers. Others speculated wildly. Was this a publicity stunt? Was she telling the truth? Why had Whitaker never acknowledged her publicly? The story cut across race, wealth, class, and power-fueling debates about hidden legacies, corporate control, and what it meant to belong. Meanwhile, Horizon Star Airlines found itself in a sudden tailspin of its own. Internal documents leaked to reporters showed that Thomas Whitaker had recently submitted a motion to overhaul the company's diversity board and invest millions in underserved aviation communities, moves that were quietly tabled by several senior executives. One of those executives had been on the very call, urging Amara to stay silent. Public trust began to crumble. Activists resurfaced old discrimination complaints against the airline. Passengers came forward with their own stories. And under mounting pressure, Horizon Star was forced to issue a public apology not just to Amara, but to all passengers whose truth had ever been denied or dismissed on our flights. The apology wasn't enough. The stock dropped 8% in 3 days. 3 executives resigned, and in a press conference broadcast globally, Amara stood at a podium flanked by civil rights attorneys and quietly read a single sentence from Thomas's letter. "What matters is not what I left you in writing. What matters is what you now know in your heart, that you belong." The world watched a girl become a voice, not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for clarity. She wasn't trying to burn anything down. She was trying to stand where no one had let her stand before with dignity. In classrooms, teachers used her story in discussions about truth and justice. On podcasts, hosts debated what Thomas's silence said about generational fear and wealth. In boardrooms, companies reviewed their whistleblower policies and re-examined the structures that let voices be dismissed. The ripple effects weren't instant, but they were real. But for Amara, the spotlight was never the point. She returned to Clara's townhouse every evening, answering calls from lawyers and media teams with the same sentence: "No interviews at this time." She kept the key on a chain around her neck and the letter from her father in a folder beneath her pillow. Every morning, she opened the window and stared into the quiet garden, waiting not for cameras, but for calm. It finally arrived one afternoon when a handwritten envelope came through the mail slot. The return address was blank. Inside was a note: "I was one of the first women Thomas pushed out of Horizon Star's senior ranks. I thought he'd forgotten me. I see now he didn't. You reminded him who he once was. Thank you for making him remember." A former executive, Amara smiled faintly. For all the noise, this was the message that stayed. The room didn't roar when Amara stepped up to the microphone. It didn't need to. It breathed. The audience wasn't filled with executives or influencers. There were no flashing brand logos, no velvet ropes, just folding chairs, 2 quiet cameras, and a row of nonprofit journalists who had shown up not for sound bites, but for truth. Amara wore a navy blue sweater, fitted jeans, and no makeup. Her hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and the silver key Thomas had given her sat quietly on a chain at her neck. She looked like a student giving a class presentation. But she stood like someone who had been waiting her whole life to be heard. She glanced down at her notes, then closed the folder and placed it aside. Her voice, when it came, was calm and steady, nothing rehearsed but fully present. "I wasn't supposed to be in seat 2D, or at least that's what some people thought. But I was. And not by accident. Because sometimes the seats people say you don't deserve are exactly the ones you were born to sit in." A few pens stopped moving. She had their attention. "I didn't know who Thomas Whitaker was when I sat down. Not really. I knew his name. I didn't know it was also mine. I didn't know I was his daughter, or that he'd been watching from a distance. I didn't know he'd left pieces of himself scattered across my life school tuition doctor bills, that field trip I thought my school paid for. I didn't know, but I always felt something missing. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands stayed folded on the podium. She took a slow breath and continued. He told me the truth at 35,000 feet, and I gave him a second chance to breathe. That's not justice. That's not irony. That's just what happens when people stop pretending they're not connected. The room stayed silent, not out of awkwardness, but out of weight. Her words landed like footsteps on polished stone, deliberate and echoing. I've been asked if I'm going to claim the inheritance, if I'll sue for the family name, if I'll take his place in business. I'm 12 years old. I don't want control. I want clarity. She unfolded a piece of Thomas's letter and held it gently. He wrote, "You were never a mistake." I read that line every night, because for so long I believed I was. There was a pause, not dramatic, just human. I'm not here to redeem his legacy. I'm here to reclaim mine. Because when people try to erase you by omission, or silence, or bureaucracy, the only thing louder than their power is your voice. She let that line hang, not as a threat, but as a mirror. She closed the letter and looked at the cameras. This is not a press tour. This is a statement for every kid told they're too complicated to explain, too unexpected to acknowledge, too poor, too black, too young to matter. I'm not proof you're wrong. I'm proof we've always been right to demand space. At the back of the room, someone dropped a pen. No one looked up. No one dared interrupt. I'm not ashamed to be Thomas Whitaker's daughter, but I will not be quiet so others can stay comfortable. He wanted me to know who I am. I do. Now you do too. She stepped back from the mic. No grand applause, no flash of PR handlers, just a small, respectful silence, followed by a slow, meaningful ripple of claps like the soft roll of thunder that comes after a storm. Not to warn, but to remind you, it's real. That night, the speech spread. Not through tabloids, but through classrooms, through articles titled "The Girl Who Refused to Be Erased," through counselors and high school teachers who replayed her voice to kids unsure of their worth. And for Amara, that was enough. She hadn't spoken to claim something. She had spoken to return something. Her name, her place, her peace. A few weeks after the press conference, Amara sat alone in the garden behind Clara's townhouse. Autumn had begun to settle across London. The leaves were copper and gold, drifting lazily in the wind like things finally allowed to fall. She wore a thick gray hoodie, the same one she had packed before boarding Flight 88. And the silver key still hung from her neck, a quiet anchor to everything that had changed. But it wasn't the key that defined her anymore. It was what she had done with it. The box in Locker 14 had held more than just documents. It had contained audio tape-sold cassette recordings Thomas had made back in the early 2000s, when voice memos were still analog. In them, he talked about legacy, regret, fear. In one of the last tapes, he spoke directly to her. "I don't know if you'll ever hear this, but if you do, I hope it finds you brave. I hope it finds you free." She had listened to that line 5 times in a row, not because she needed the words, but because she needed to believe he had meant them. She wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way she had expected. Her grief didn't look like slamming doors or shouted questions. It looked like quiet moments in between headlines, like folding a letter for the 15th time, like watching the world talk about you while you try to remember the sound of your own voice. But even in that quiet, Amara had made a decision. She declined the estate, most of it. The lawyers were stunned. She kept only one portion, a fund Thomas had created years ago, originally intended for silent philanthropic work. With Clara's help, she redirected it into something new. The Blake Whitaker Initiative, a foundation designed not just for girls like her, but led by them. It offered travel scholarships, legal guidance for minors in guardianship limbo, and most importantly, a storytelling grant for young people who had once been silenced. She launched it from a library, not a ballroom, not a private school, just a library tucked behind a council building in East London, where she stood with a group of other teenagers, some loud, some shy, all bright, and said, "This isn't about charity. It's about access. It's about never again having to explain why you were sitting in that seat." The launch didn't trend. It didn't go viral. And that was fine. Because Amara wasn't building something for the attention. She was building it for endurance. Weeks turned to months. The story faded from front pages but stayed alive in subtle ways. A classroom play inspired by her speech. A podcast series about truth and lineage. A college essay that quoted her final line, "I'm not going away. I'm just getting started." And though the airline tried its best to repair its image, people remembered what happened. Not because of scandal, but because a 12-year-old girl had told the truth without apology. As for Amara, she returned to school in Baltimore under a different name. Not to hide, but to reclaim her own rhythm. She still kept the key. Still wrote letters to Naomi she never sent. Still lit a candle on the night of Thomas's birthday. Not because she missed him as a father, but because she understood him, finally, as a man. One afternoon, on a school trip to Washington, D.C., she passed by the Lincoln Memorial. A plaque caught her eye. It read, "To sit in silence is to accept the story others write for you." She smiled. That wasn't her anymore. Her story had already taken flight. And this time she was in the pilot's seat.